Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea McCutcheon and I wanted to talk to you about a book review that I did on a book called In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. The author of this is Carol Gilligan. She's very, very good in her book. So, to get started, what is this book about? This book is very interesting to read and learn about, so you should read it. I recommend it. It is based on a revolution because the author wanted to research men and women to see how they would react to certain questions that she had asked them. She even researched Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development of children. One of her main focuses was on pregnant women to see how they feel about themselves. Another main thing that she focused on was both men and women because she wanted to see if they would respond to the questions she asked them the same or differently. In his stages of moral development, she focused on his stages of moral development because in her study she realized that most of the participants that he worked with were mostly males. She was a colleague of his, but he later became her mentor on the stages of moral development. She took to the stages theory to better understand moral development. However, while researching his stages, she didn't agree with them. So in order to make things better for herself to understand them, she took matters into her own hands. She started a proposal for moral development for women. She also started interviewing women about their lives to see if her development for women would work. While going further into Kohlberg's investigation, she found out that women had turned out to score lower and be less developed than men had. So in order to better understand this, she went into researching a guy named Erik Erikson. He thought that the separation was from the mother and the family. However, her reply was that she thought women were not inferior and in their personal and moral development, but they were different. While researching Erik Erikson and about women, she came up with her own conclusion and her own theory on this. Her theory is called Gilligan's Stages of the Ethnic of Care. Her research. In her book, she thinks of it as a communication theory. In her theory, she thinks that women tend to speak differently and act differently than men do whenever either are faced with an ethical dilemma. So she did her own research on women. In her research, she found out that women were to be less certain of their own moral analysis than men. She had a couple of ideas. In her ideas, she had reinforced some of the old stereotypes about gender differences. And while doing this, it seemed to undermine an axiom of traditional feminism. This feminism was called the gender become a social construction. Moving along in her research, she interviewed women and men, and she asked them a lot of questions. When she asked them this particular question, how would you describe yourself? She found out that women describe themselves by describing the relationships that they had been in. However, when she had asked men the same question, they would describe themselves by separation or just by first-person statements, such as, I just describe myself as whatever. She also believed that psychology wanted to think of women as men. She thought it was wrong for women because they wouldn't follow the path that was laid out for men. So basically, she was saying she wanted women to follow the path of men. Men had a path they had followed, so she thought that women follow that same path. She did research on women in particularly as I said earlier, she did it on pregnancy and abortion as well. So, she had interviewed 29 women who had referrals from counseling centers on pregnancy and abortion. However, there has been sufficient evidence of a divergence in moral development between men and women that came from Hahn and Holstein. These two had findings that led them to question the possibility of a sex-related bias in Kohlberg's system. The system is based on his 6-stage description of moral development. There are 3 stages of this. 1 is pre-conventional, 2 is conventional, and 3 is post-conventional. Now going into these stages, the first stage, as I said in the previous slide, is the pre-conventional stage. This stage shows women exploring to find who they are. In other words, they mostly felt alone in a hostile world, not able to look past their own self-interest. So they're trying to explore who they are. They're trying to invent themselves. The second stage is the conventional stage. This stage is the goodness of self-sacrifice. The women would sacrifice themselves and think of themselves and only themselves and as selfless people, and they would begin caring about people. Most women are like this in our society today. Some women aren't. And finally, the third stage is the post-conventional stage. This stage deals with the responsibility for the consequences of their choice, meaning that as women, we make a choice and then they decide to take responsibility for the choice they made. So basically, the choices you make have consequences. You have to learn to take responsibility for the consequences of the choices that you made. Women in our society, when women feel excluded from any participation in society today, they see themselves as the subject of consensus or judgment that is made and enforced by the men on whose protection and support they always depend on. Basically, they see judgment in themselves today, but they also depend on the men in their lives to protect them and support them. In other words, to the extent that women perceive themselves as having no choice at all, if they don't have a choice in any matter, they would excuse themselves from the responsibility that the decision has entailed. Now with the availability now in our society of choice, we make our own choices. Along with it, the onus of responsibility has now invaded the most private sector of the women's domain and threatened a similar explosion. Therefore, women have deferred to the judgment of men. They leave the judgments up to the men. So even if they make a choice, they still have to have the men decide if that choice is right or wrong for them. They leave the judgments up to the men. What I would like to propose is some recommendations for further research on this topic if you would like to go through with it. There's been so much research into this topic that the author did that I'm sure some of you who would like to read this book will have a lot more questions and want to do more research on this. My recommendations for further research on this book would be to maybe interview men and women on your own and see if the answers that you come up with in your interviews are the same as the authors. If your answers are different than hers, which in some cases they might be. You could compare the two and see what's different about them. In my conclusion, I would like to conclude this presentation. The book really puts into perspective the theories and gender differentiation we have been talking about all semester, as well as Carol's point of view on these same theories. It seems like she wanted to see what it felt like for men and women when they spoke up. She really pointed out the differences between men and women when they were speaking to her as the questions that she asked. All in all, I really enjoyed reading her book. It was really interesting to learn about the theories and points that she made regarding men's and women's voices today. We all have a different voice. We all have a voice. We should speak up and stand up for what's right in our society today. I hope you enjoyed this and thank you for watching.